All right. So I want you to think about something, and what we're going to get into today is chapter 13, the European Middle Ages. And the first question that kind of poses with this whole section is, what freedoms would you give up for protection? And, you know, you kind of think about it, in the United States that we live in, there's a ton of freedoms that we have all of the time, and that we kind of take for granted because we are always granted those freedoms. But there is some instances that you yourself live with that you do give up certain freedoms. So if you kind of think about it, it says, think about other people who have limited power over their lives. All right. So you should have a prime example of how you live a limited, powerful life right now based upon age. All right. So kind of give me some examples of some things that you give up whenever you're under the age of 18 versus whenever you're 21 or above, or you're 18 and above in some cases. What are some of the examples of freedoms that you give up right now versus things that you'll be able to have later on for protection? What's that? You say dress code?
Yeah.
Well, honestly, that is. I mean, it's a freedom, right? As far as whenever you get out of school, depending upon what your work environment is, you know what I mean? There's still going to be some dress regulations based upon if you go to college, dress regulations if you go to a certain job, things like that. But there's a lot of different ways about if you have facial hair, if you have earrings, if you have a beard, if you get to wear whatever you want to wear within a regulation, it opens up a whole lot more because you are not in a school setting. Okay, so there's one. What else? What else? Driving. Okay, being able to, even if something as simple, let's say here, as leaving to drive your car to go to lunch. You know what I mean? That's one thing. Then you back it up, and the ability to drive without someone in the car, the ability to drive with multiple friends in the car at the same time. See, we didn't ever have the stipulation of you had to have a limited number of people under the certain age. Like you got, how many people you can't ride, or can you ride with anybody as far as your age? What's the law now for like?
I think it's only like one person to like you have to be licensed for like half a year.
Okay, so the distraction wise of having all of these young people within the car, and seeing like whenever I was your age, so we lived on a dairy, and I got my hardship. I got my license whenever I was 15 years old, and was able to drive a car whenever I was 15. Now I could only drive. I think it was like from 7 a.m. in the morning until 11 at night. Like I couldn't technically be out past 11 with my license, or you get a ticket for that. But I remember like leaving football practice as a freshman, and everybody that could fit in my Mustang was fitting in my Mustang. You know what I mean? And we were going off to somebody's house in between practices and going there. And then now, if you can only have one, you know, that's kind of that's a freedom that you guys have definitely given up. There's regulations. They're there. Okay, so good. Give me one more. What about your parents? What about, I mean, that's protection as far as your parents wise. What are some freedoms you give up at home for the protection of having a house, having food on the table, having a normal everyday setting? What are some of those freedoms that you give up just because you're of your age and you're living at home? Okay, got to help out with chores, certain things that are there, whether they ask you to take out the trash or clean or whatever else. What about like a cell phone? I mean, do any of you have anything where your parents monitor, you know, what's on your cell phone, what you're doing with your cell phone? They have the ability to, whenever they ask you for it, that you got to type in the passcode and hand it over to them or anything like that? Anybody have that? Nope. Free reign. You got it there. There's a lot of parents that I know previously, you know, they would have an app that would, every single time their kid got a text or they did anything else like that, it would actually go to their phone but the kid doesn't ever know it. You know what I mean? Because AT&T sells a package that's like that, that's on there, to where parents can get everything that their kid's getting, but the kid never knows that it's actually on there. And had one girl, I remember her mom, we were in a conversation one time, and she didn't know how to approach her daughter because her daughter didn't know that she was monitoring every single one of the texts that were going through there and things like that. So, it's kind of a freedom that you think you have and you may not have based upon your parents that are there. So how we're relating this to today is the idea of feudalism. Okay, the idea of feudalism. It says, you are living in a countryside off of Western Europe during the 1100s. Like about 90% of the population, peasants were working the land. Okay, so 10% were the landholders and 90% were the peasants that were there, and they were working the land. It says, your family's hut is located in a small village on the Lord's estate. The Lord provides all your basic needs, including housing, food, and protection. Especially important in this protection from invaders who would repeatedly strike Europe. It says, for the safety of the peasants, they were living outside of the walls of the Lord. If anyone came to attack, because they were working essentially on the Lord's land and for the Lord that owned everything, they had the ability to go behind the walls for protection. They weren't going to live behind the walls, but if something bad was about to go down, they knew that they always had that protection behind the walls that they could get to. It says the peasants owe their Lord 2 or 3 days' labor a week farming his land. All right. So you were granted a percentage of land. It was yours, kind of, but you owed 2 to 3 days worth of work per week working the Lord's land. So that way he didn't have to work it, but it was already finished. It was already there. So you were essentially giving back to him. It says the peasants feel that the right to stay on the Lord's land is more important than the freedom to actually leave the land. Why would they think that? Why would it be more important to stay on somebody that they were forced to work with for 2 to 3 days a week as compared to going off on their own and owning their own piece of land? What's the first problem? Would they have the money to buy their own land? No. Okay. So they were probably granted more land because they worked for the Lord. They didn't have the startup to be able to buy what they wanted to have. So therefore they were kind of stuck where they were. It says the peasants could not marry without the Lord's consent. They could not leave the estate without the Lord's consent. So they were kind of trapped where they were at. So they really had no freedoms. So why would they be obedient to the idea of having to stay on the Lord's land? Because, none of that sounds good. Like, if I can't go where I want to go, if I can't marry who I want to marry, if I don't have the opportunity to move where I want to move, and I have to stay locked into this for my entire life, why would that be something that anybody would partake in? What do you think? Free land? In essence, it was an opportunity for land that they would not have an opportunity to have. So therefore, it kind of was free with a lot of price to pay. All right, but why would they go with it? So then we fast forward to slavery later on, say in the 1800s. How come whenever there were so many more slaves than landowners, did the slaves just not automatically revolt? Why do you think it was that way? If there's 200 slaves and there's 4 people that are there that are managing them, why didn't they just take over the 4 people that were there? What's your thoughts on that? It's all right to speak. Give it a try. Don't be afraid to be wrong. Why didn't they just beat them up, take their land? It's what's that? Okay, so they had other people that were there to protect them. All right. Was there anywhere to go? No. I mean, you sit there and you think about the idea of feudalism. There wasn't any other land. If you went to somebody else's land or somebody overtook it, well, you're going to be under somebody else's reign. If you were a slave during that time, you came from another country, you were unfamiliar with the area, so therefore there wasn't really a whole lot of options. You're kind of stuck. If you're used to it or you're born into it, and somebody provided you with housing and food and clothing and everything else you needed, was there any reason to necessarily look for something else? Not really. I mean, it was already there, and that's all you ever knew. Okay. So as long as it was providing for you, it kind of made it simple, and you kind of just fell in line with what it was because it was already provided, and that generation understood that it was provided. All right. So it says some of the examples about, we talked about indentured servitude, slavery, the freedoms means and how important it is to students' lives and how it is important to the people that were in this idea of feudalism. You know, security is important because if you're not safe, then you don't have an opportunity to go through any of your freedoms. If you're not alive, none of these freedoms mean anything. So based upon the attackers, based upon the idea, as long as they were kept safe, they were going to do whatever was deemed necessary. They were going to give up whatever freedoms were necessary. So then that way they could end up being able to continue farming, continue making a way, continue having children. They at least had the opportunity to marry, but it wasn't marrying wherever they wanted. It was going to be marrying somebody within the feudal system to keep them in that same system that's there. All right. So the first part of chapter 13, section 1, again, kind of getting into the idea of how it was all set up. In Europe, one of the big things was, the Roman Empire and kind of the Roman Empire falling, and then they're going to try to bring it all back together underneath Charlemagne. All right? So it says, by the end of the 4th century, invaders from many different Germanic groups overran the Roman Empire in the West. Their arrival and the collapse of the Roman rule had several effects. The attacks put a halt to trade, as it was not safe to move goods from one place to another. The end of the Roman government and the decline in trade made cities less important. As cities faded, nobles moved to the countryside. Poor people followed them, hoping to be able to grow their own food. The general level of education of the society became lower. Why would the general education level become lower? What are people no longer doing because they're in cities? Yeah, nobody's forcing them to go to school. They're not trying to better the city. They're having them work, and it's more productive to have them to work. So they're becoming educated, but they're becoming educated in how to farm rather than becoming educated how to make themselves better. All right. It says, as they settled in different areas, they began to blend Latin with phrases of their own. Their language developed into different dialects, and Europe no longer had a single language to understand. By about 400 to 600, Europe was the scene of turmoil and chaos as small Germanic kingdoms fought each other for overall power. Long-held Roman ideas about law were replaced by Germanic ideas of society based on close personal ties. The church was very, very big. The church was the only thing that really gave them order. It was the only thing that they could always rely on, that they could always look to. All right. It says the church provided the only sense of order, and in 496, Clovis, the king of the Franks, became a Christian with all of his warriors. From then on, the Pope in Rome supported the military efforts of Clovis. He was one of many leaders to become a Christian, and the church made an effort to bring these people to the religion. It also set up new communities called monasteries. Monasteries were men called monks and women called nuns, and they lived their entire life devoted to God. The monasteries became important because their libraries preserved some of the writings of the ancient world and the ideas of what the Romans had preached. The church also grew in importance when Gregory I became Pope in 590. He made the guardian of the spiritual lives of all Christians. He also made the Pope an important power in governing part of Italy. And that's the reason why you see the Roman Catholic Church very, very important in Europe. All right, because it was appointed as the Pope was the guiding figure. People looked to the church rather than a government for what the leadership role was. The kingdom of the Franks covered much of modern France. By 700s, the most important official was the mayor of the palace, and even more powerful than the king. He made laws and controlled the army. And in 719, Charles Martel became mayor and expanded the lands controlled by the Franks. He also won a battle in 732 against the Muslim forces moving north from Spain. This ended the Muslim threat to Europe and made Martel a Christian hero. The idea of a hero, that was a big deal because everybody wants to look up to someone, kind of like we still don heroes today. This idea of knights in shining armor, the idea of chivalry that we'll get to, the idea of a hero, someone doing something extraordinary and having someone to look up to was really emphasized during this time. His son Pepin was crowned king. One of his sons, Charlemagne, became king of the land of the Franks in 771, and at 6 feet 4 inches tall, Charlemagne towered over most people of his time. With military skill, he expanded his kingdom to make it larger than any known since ancient Rome. By 800, he held most of modern Italy, all of France, and parts of modern Spain and Germany. Pope Leo III crowned him emperor. With that, the power of the church and the German kings joined the heritage of the old Roman Empire. So the whole part of after the Roman Empire fell was to rejoin and regain all of that land that was lost in the Roman Empire. And Charlemagne's big deal was to try to create a powerful Europe just like the Roman Empire was. Charlemagne cut the power of the nobles in his empire and increased his own. He traveled throughout his lands, visiting the people and judging cases. He brought well-read men to his courts and sponsored a revival of learning. However, Charlemagne's empire broke into pieces soon after his death. All right, so the idea of everything that he built up to was lost upon his death. All right, so that's kind of an introduction to the idea of Charlemagne uniting the kingdoms. All right, so what I want you to do now is go to Canvas. And on Canvas, I slid up chapter 13 modules to the top. I'm going to kind of condense the way that you took your notes last time. So instead of going through the entire PowerPoint and putting notes on per page and everything else, what I want you to do is I want you to use your PowerPoint to answer the questions on chapter 13, section 1. There's only 6. All right. But as you answer your questions, I want you to make notes of these 6 things. Okay. Those are the 6 key points that are there. Write in a little bit extra. Don't just write down like number 1 means this, and that's it on your notes. If there's a little bit extra that surrounds the top and the bottom of the answer for your question, make sure you kind of add that in your notes so you can kind of get like a little brief summary about what it is. Okay, so go to modules, go to chapter 13. I'm going to make this quiz right here live. And as soon as I publish that one, okay, it should be published to where you can go to chapter 13, section 1. There's 6 questions. You will use your PowerPoint that's right above it. And when you use your PowerPoint right above it, use the information that's to the top and the bottom of the PowerPoint to add to your either typed or handwritten notes. So then again, that way you have something to kind of look back on whenever you get into the test area. You won't be able to use them on this test. You're going to have to study them on this test. But anyway, chapter 13, section 1, 6 questions. Use your PowerPoint that's surrounded by it. Write down the notes top and bottom, and you're good. Okay, any questions? Charlemagne, big emphasis on that right there.